She writes complicated stories, but not even in her wildest creative spiral would she imagine herself starring in a scene like this, walking into the wrong place, interrupting someone else's wedding, and being looked at by a stranger as if she had stepped out of a sophisticated comedy completely out of control. What seems like the most humiliating day of her life soon becomes the beginning of a delicious mess filled with teasing, tension, and feelings no one ever planned to have. Ruby Caldwell's heels hit the stone steps of St. Andrew's Church like a countdown, each step louder than the last, each step closer to the moment she'd been rehearsing since 3 in the morning. She was going to stop this wedding. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the kind of fury that lives right next to love, the kind that makes you do something insane because doing nothing would be worse. Her father, the only family she had left since her mother passed 8 years ago, was about to marry a woman half his age who had appeared in his life like a plot twist too convenient to be real. And he hadn't even invited his own daughter. Aunt Helen had called at midnight, whispered the address like a spy passing classified information. "Go," she'd said, "before it's too late." So Ruby went. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors, and the smell hit her first, lilies and warm candle wax and something sweet that clung to the back of her throat. The church was full, every pew packed with people in their Sunday best, heads turned toward the altar where the ceremony was already underway. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure the people in the back row could hear it. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight down the center aisle, heels punching the carpet, chin up, shoulders back, wearing the kind of determination that looks a lot like recklessness when you're watching it from the outside. "Stop!" Her voice rang through the church like a bell nobody expected. "Stop this wedding right now!" The silence that followed had weight. The organist's hands froze above the keys. A flower girl dropped her basket. Somewhere near the front, an elderly woman clutched her pearls, literally clutched them as if Ruby had personally threatened the institution of marriage. And then Ruby looked at the groom. He was not her father. The man standing at the altar was young, maybe 30, with kind brown eyes currently the size of dinner plates. His mouth hung open just enough to suggest his brain was still loading. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Ruby blinked. The bride stood frozen beside him, bouquet suspended in midair like a still frame from a movie. She was beautiful, clearly in shock, and very much not the 24-year-old Instagram model Ruby had been expecting. Wrong church, wrong wedding, wrong everything. Her stomach dropped to her heels. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing useful came out. For a woman who made a living putting words on paper, she had absolutely none. Then she noticed him, standing to the right of the groom, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to one side. The best man. Tall, taller than anyone else up there, filling out a dark suit that looked like it had been cut specifically for shoulders that broad. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, not angry, not horrified, something closer to fascinated, like he'd stumbled onto something unexpected and hadn't decided yet whether it was a disaster or the best entertainment he'd had in months. Their eyes met for 2 full seconds, 2 seconds that felt oddly specific, like the first line of a chapter she hadn't planned. "She's insane," someone whispered from the 3rd row. That broke the spell. This isn't—" Ruby stepped back. "I'm so sorry. I have the wrong—" "Someone call the police." The voice erupted from a round man in a too-tight vest near the center aisle, already on his feet, phone in hand, face red with the kind of outrage usually reserved for parking disputes. "Sir, that's really not necessary. She just disrupted a wedding. That's trespassing." "I didn't trespass. The door was wide open." "Harold, sit down," his wife hissed, pulling his sleeve. Harold did not sit down. Harold was having the most exciting Saturday of his life, and he wasn't letting it go. Ruby looked at the bride. "I'm so sorry. This is a terrible mistake. I thought this was someone else's wedding, and I—" "Ma'am?" A voice from behind her. She turned to find a church usher with the face of a man who had seen everything except this. "I think it's best if you wait outside." She nodded. Outside. Yes. And then perhaps a new city, a new name, a small island with no churches. As she turned, her heel caught on the carpet runner. She stumbled, didn't fall, but stumbled enough for a gasp to ripple through the pews. She caught herself, straightened her spine, and walked out, carrying whatever dignity she had left, which was almost none. The October air slapped her face as she pushed through the doors, cool, sharp smelling of damp leaves and street exhaust. She pressed her back against the stone wall and covered her face with both hands. "This is not happening," she whispered into her palms. But it was. And 20 minutes later, when a police cruiser pulled up and a tired-looking officer stepped out holding a notepad and the energy of a man who'd rather be literally anywhere else, Ruby Caldwell understood that her day had just gotten worse. She climbed into the back seat without arguing. There was nothing left to argue about. The leather seat was cold through the fabric of her dress, and as the car pulled away from the church, she caught one last glimpse through the window, the best man, standing on the steps, watching the cruiser leave, hands in his pockets. That same unreadable expression on his face. She turned away and stared at her hands in her lap. Her father's wedding was still out there, happening without her. And she was on her way to a police station in heels, and a dress she'd picked out at 6 in the morning, because she truly, desperately thought, she could save him. The bench at the Midtown precinct smelled like old coffee and bad decisions. Ruby sat on it with her ankles crossed, her back straight, and the posture of a woman trying very hard to look like she didn't belong there, which she didn't. She was a published novelist, for God's sake. She had a literary agent. She had a cat mug collection. People who collect cat mugs do not end up in police stations. And yet, the officer behind the front desk, a heavy-set man with a mustache that looked like it had been there since 1987, typed something on his computer without looking at her. He'd been typing for 12 minutes. She'd been counting. "Can I at least explain what happened?" she asked. "You did explain." He didn't look up. "Twice." "Right, but I feel like the nuance was lost." "Ma'am, you walked into a wedding and told everyone to stop. That's the whole story. That's the headline. The story has context." He finally looked at her. His expression said he'd heard a lot of context from a lot of people on that bench, and none of it had ever been as interesting as they thought it was. Ruby pressed her lips together and sat back. Fine. She'd wait. The station hummed around her, a phone ringing somewhere in the back, the squeak of a chair wheel, the low murmur of two officers sharing what smelled like reheated pizza. A fluorescent light above her buzzed at a frequency specifically designed to make everything feel worse. She thought about her father. Right now, somewhere across town, Robert Caldwell was probably saying "I do" to a woman named Vanessa, who'd shown up in his life 7 months ago with perfect hair, a subscription smile, and the kind of interest in a 62-year-old widower that didn't add up unless you counted his retirement fund. Ruby had tried to talk to him, calmly at first, then less calmly, then in a voicemail that she regretted before she'd even hung up. He accused her of being jealous, resentful, unable to accept that he could be happy again after her mother. That one had landed like a punch. She wasn't jealous. She was terrified, because she could see what he refused to, that this woman didn't love him. And the worst part was, there was no way to say that without sounding exactly like the ungrateful daughter he'd decided she was. The station door opened. She looked up, expecting another officer, maybe a lawyer, maybe the end of the world coming to finish the job. It was none of those. It was the best man. He walked in like he owned the building, not arrogantly, but with the kind of ease that comes from being used to walking into rooms and knowing exactly what to do once you're there. His suit jacket was unbuttoned now. A watch caught the fluorescent light on his left wrist. He scanned the room, found her, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition, followed by something that looked dangerously close to amusement. He walked to the front desk. "Officer, I'm here about the woman who was brought in from St. Andrew's Church." The mustache looked up. "And you are?" "Anthony Crawford. I was at the wedding." "You pressing charges?" "No. And neither is anyone else. The groom and bride don't wish to pursue this, and the gentleman who called, Harold, has been talked down by his wife." He placed a hand on the counter, relaxed, as though they were discussing the weather. There was no property damage, no physical contact, and no real disruption beyond a brief delay that the bride has already forgiven. I'd say we can wrap this up. Ruby watched him from the bench, arms folded. Part of her was flooded with relief. The other part, the stubborn, proud, furious part, didn't love being rescued by a stranger who looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne advertisement. The officer sighed, glanced at his screen, then at Ruby, then back at Anthony. She's free to go, but if there's a next time, there won't be, Anthony said. I can speak for myself, Ruby said from the bench. Anthony turned around. Up close, his eyes were a dark grey-green, steady and sharp, the kind of eyes that didn't miss things. Can you? Because from what I saw, speaking for yourself is what got you here. She stood. The bench was low, and even in heels, the top of her head barely reached his chin. I had the wrong address. That's all. That's all. He raised an eyebrow. You marched down the aisle of a stranger's wedding, stopped the ceremony and got escorted out by police. I've seen corporate takeovers with less drama. It sounds worse when you say it like that. It sounds worse when anyone says it. She wanted to be angry. She really did. But something in his delivery, the dry precision of it, the slight curl at the corner of his mouth, made the anger impossible to hold. Do you crash weddings often? He asked. Or was this your debut? First time, she said. But if I need practice, your wedding's next on the list. He laughed. A real laugh. Short, surprised, like she'd caught him off guard for the first time in a long while. The sound of it bounced off the precinct walls, warm against all that cold, fluorescent light. They walked outside together. The October air had cooled further, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. She hugged her arms against the chill and told him everything. The words poured out like she'd been holding them back with both hands and had finally let go. Her father, the young wife, the secret wedding, Aunt Helen's late-night call with the wrong address, the desperate, stupid, brave decision to show up and stop it. He listened without interrupting. Leaned against the brick wall of the precinct, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on her face, and just listened. When she finished, the silence between them felt different from the silence inside. Your aunt gave you the wrong church, he said finally. Apparently. And your father doesn't know you tried. Ruby looked down at her shoes. One heel had a scuff from the carpet. He doesn't even know I found out. Anthony was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone. Give me your number. She looked up. Why? Because you just had the worst day of your life, and I think next week you're going to want someone to laugh about it with who was actually there. She stared at him. Then she took the phone and typed her number. He glanced at the screen. Ruby Caldwell. Anthony Crawford, she said, half mocking his formal tone. I'll text you, he said, already walking toward a black car parked by the curb. What if I don't answer? He opened the car door and looked back at her with that same unreadable calm. You will. She watched the car pull away into the evening traffic, the taillights blurring into the grey of the street. Her dress was wrinkled. Her pride was bruised. Her father was married to a stranger. But for the first time all day, the knot in her chest had loosened, just a little. The first message arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the worst Saturday of Ruby's life. She was sitting at her kitchen table in an oversized sweater, hair piled in a knot that had given up on structure 2 hours ago, staring at a manuscript she hadn't touched in a week. The cursor blinked on page 47 like a tiny heartbeat that expected something from her. She had nothing to give it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Quick question. Is there a statute of limitations on wedding crashing, or should I keep a lawyer on standby? She stared at the screen, read it again, and for the first time in 3 days, something close to a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She typed back, Depends. Are you texting to check on me or to gather evidence? The reply came in under a minute. Both. How are you holding up? She thought about lying, typing fine and leaving it there, the way she always did when someone asked that question. But something about the directness of his message, no small talk, no easing in, made her want to match it. Honestly? Not great. But I'm alive and not in jail, so the bar is low and I'm clearing it. That's the spirit. Low bars and freedom. She laughed, out loud, alone in her kitchen, at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. It startled her cat, who gave her a look of pure judgment from the windowsill. That was how it started. Over the next 2 weeks, the messages became a rhythm. Morning texts that weren't quite greetings, more like the continuation of a conversation that never fully stopped. He sent her a link to a reality show about competitive baking, where a contestant dropped an entire cake and blamed the oven. She sent back a voice note, laughing so hard she couldn't finish her sentence. He replied that her laugh sounded like someone trying to start a lawnmower, and she told him his sense of humor belonged in a corporate training manual. They talked about everything, except the things that mattered most. She told him about her novels. She wrote romance, the kind with messy people and complicated feelings and endings that earned their happiness. He admitted he hadn't read a novel in years, but that he'd read the first chapter of her latest book online and thought the opening line was one of the best things he'd read since college. She screenshot that message and saved it in a folder she would never admit existed. He told her about his company, tech consulting, which sounded boring until he described it as convincing very smart people to stop doing very stupid things repeatedly for a lot of money. She told him that sounded like parenting. He said the comparison was more accurate than she'd think. They never talked on the phone, only texts. It felt safer that way, a buffer that let them be honest without the pressure of silence or the weight of tone. She could be funny in texts without worrying about her voice cracking. He could be thoughtful without it sounding like a rehearsed speech. But underneath the jokes and the links and the late-night arguments about whether pineapple belongs on pizza, it doesn't, she maintained, and he called her a coward for not trying it. Something else was forming, a shape she didn't have a name for yet. She noticed things. He always texted her back within minutes during the day, no matter how busy he claimed to be. When she mentioned a headache once casually, in the middle of a conversation about terrible movie sequels, he circled back to it an hour later and asked if she'd taken anything. When she sent a joke that landed flat, he didn't ignore it. He made fun of it, gently, in a way that made her feel seen rather than embarrassed. Anthony noticed things too. He noticed that she deflected with humor whenever the conversation veered toward her father, that she used exclamation marks when she was trying to seem lighter than she felt, that at 11 at night her messages got quieter, shorter, softer, stripped of the armor she wore during the day. Those were the messages he reread. One night she sent, "Do you think people can love someone and still fail them completely?" He stared at that message for a long time. The blue glow of the screen lit up the ceiling of his bedroom. He could hear the hum of the city through the window. Distant traffic, the low moan of a bus stopping somewhere below. He typed and deleted 3 different responses. Too light, too heavy, too much. Finally, he wrote, "Yes. I think that's most of what love looks like, actually. People trying and getting it wrong." She didn't reply for 9 minutes. Then, "That might be the most honest thing anyone said to me in months." He put his phone on his chest and stared at the ceiling. His apartment was large and silent and expensive, and for the first time in a long time it felt too quiet. She hadn't mentioned her father in a week, but Anthony knew. He could feel the weight of it pressing through her words, bending the edges of her sentences, making the jokes a little sharper, the laughter a little harder. She was carrying something heavy, and she was carrying it alone because that was the only way she knew how. It bothered him. Not in the way business problems bothered him. Those had solutions, spreadsheets, timelines. This was different. This was the kind of problem that lived in someone's chest, and you couldn't fix it with a phone call or a meeting. You could only sit near it and hope your presence made it lighter. He wasn't used to that. He was used to fixing things, to being the person who walked into the room and untangled whatever had gone wrong. But Ruby Caldwell and her sharp tongue, and her wounded pride and her midnight honesty, she wasn't a knot he could untie. She was a person he was starting to care about more than made sense for someone he'd met at a police station 3 weeks ago. On a Friday night, she texted him a photo of her cat sitting on her manuscript. The caption read, "My editor has notes." He smiled at his phone in the back seat of his car, on his way home from a dinner that had bored him half to death. And he realized, with the quiet certainty of a door clicking shut, that she was the best part of every single day. He didn't text that, not yet. Instead, he wrote, "Tell your editor I'll buy the first signed copy. But what he meant was something else entirely. Rain had been falling for 3 days straight, and Ruby's apartment had started to feel like the inside of a closed fist. She stood at the window with a mug of tea she'd forgotten to drink, watching the water slide down the glass in crooked lines. The street below was grey and blurred, and the only sound in the apartment was the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional huff of her cat disapproving of the weather from the couch. She hadn't written a word in 5 days. Not because she didn't have ideas, she had too many. But every time she sat down to write, the same thought crept in like a draft under the door. Her father hadn't called, not once since the wedding. She'd found out, through Aunt Helen, that the ceremony had gone ahead. Vanessa was now Mrs. Caldwell. They'd honeymooned in Cancun. There were photos on Facebook. Her father smiling in a way that looked genuine, and that was the part that hurt the most. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger had a pulse to it, an energy. This was something flatter, duller, the feeling of being left behind by someone who was supposed to stay. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Anthony. "What are you doing right now?" She looked down at herself. Sweatpants. The same sweater from yesterday. Hair situation best described as unsalvageable. "Writing," she typed. "You're lying." "How would you know?" "Because when you're actually writing, you don't answer me for hours. You responded in 11 seconds. She hated that he'd noticed that. She also loved it in a way she refused to examine. "Fine, I'm staring out the window like a Victorian ghost. Happy?" "Extremely, don't move." "What?" No reply. She stared at the screen for a full minute, waiting. Nothing. She put the phone down, picked it up again, typed Anthony and then deleted it. Typed it again, deleted it again. The tea was cold. The rain was still falling. The cat had relocated to the top of the bookshelf, which meant the barometric pressure was doing something unforgivable. 40 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Ruby set down the mug she'd been holding like a prop and walked to the door. She almost didn't open it. She looked terrible, and if he was on the other side, which some instinct told her he was, she'd rather meet him looking like a human being and not a haunted attic. She opened it anyway. Anthony Crawford stood in her hallway, his dark hair damp from the rain. The collar of his coat turned up, holding something against his chest. Something small, something warm. Something with big brown eyes and floppy ears and a pink ribbon tied in a bow around its neck. A golden retriever puppy. The puppy looked up at Ruby with the kind of pure, uncomplicated love that only very young dogs and very old grandmothers are capable of. Its tail wagged so fast, its entire back end moved with it. Ruby looked at the puppy, then at Anthony, then back at the puppy. Her chin trembled first, then her eyes, then the rest of her. The tears came before any word could. Not sad tears, the other kind. The kind that show up when something cracks open a part of you that's been sealed shut for too long, and the light gets in all at once. She took the puppy from his arms. It was heavier than she expected, warm and squirming and smelling like that specific puppy smell, milk and fur and new life. The little body pressed against her chest, and a tiny pink tongue darted out and licked her jaw. She laughed through the tears, a messy hiccuping sound that made Anthony's chest tighten in a way he hadn't prepared for. She set the puppy down on the hallway floor. The little thing immediately tumbled over her own paws, recovered and sprinted toward the living room with the confidence of someone who'd already decided this was home. Then Ruby turned back to him, and before he could speak, before he could make one of his dry, clever comments about the weather or the puppy or the state of her hair, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed his forehead, then his left cheek, then his right, then his chin, his jaw, the bridge of his nose. "Thank you." Kiss. "Thank you." Kiss. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Each word pressed into a different part of his face, warm and wet with tears, and Anthony, who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, who had stared down boardrooms full of hostile investors, who had once told a senator he was wrong to his face without blinking, stood there completely defenseless. His arms moved on their own. Both hands found her waist, and he lifted her off the ground. She weighed almost nothing. Her feet dangled and her arms tightened around his neck, and she buried her face against his shoulder, still crying, still laughing, and he held her there in the doorway with the rain coming down outside and the puppy barking somewhere behind them, and the whole thing feeling like something he'd remember for the rest of his life. He smelled like rain and wool and something warmer underneath. Cedar, maybe. She didn't want to let go. When he finally set her down, her eyes were red and her smile was enormous, and he thought, with a certainty that startled him, that this was the most beautiful she'd ever looked. He didn't say that. He said, "She's 8 weeks old. The breeder said she's already house-trained, but I wouldn't trust that information." Ruby wiped her face with both hands. "You got me a dog. I got you a very small, very badly coordinated roommate." She chewed through the seatbelt on the way here. They found the puppy in the living room, already asleep on a cushion she'd pulled off the couch. The pink ribbon had slipped sideways, giving her the look of a tiny, drunk partygoer. Ruby sat on the floor next to her and rested a hand on the soft rise and fall of the puppy's belly. Anthony sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Why?" she asked quietly. He looked at the puppy instead of at her. "You've been alone in this apartment for weeks, and you're too stubborn to ask for company. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." It wasn't. But the real answer, the one that had been building in him since the night she'd asked him if people could love someone and still fail them, wasn't something he was ready to say out loud. Not yet. Not while she was this fragile and this close and looking at him with those damp eyes that made him feel like the ground was tilting. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the couch. Ruby chose a terrible series about a chef who couldn't cook trying to save a failing restaurant. Anthony said it was the worst thing he'd ever seen. Then he watched 4 episodes without complaining. The puppy slept between them, a warm lump of golden fur that occasionally twitched in her dreams. At some point, Ruby's head drifted sideways and landed on his shoulder. She didn't move it. He didn't move either. Neither of them said what was obvious, that this didn't feel like friendship anymore, that it probably hadn't for a while, that the space between their shoulders had been shrinking for weeks, and now there was none left. The rain kept falling. The puppy snored, and Ruby, for the first time in longer than she could remember, didn't feel alone. She fell asleep like that, head on his shoulder, hand resting on the puppy's back, and Anthony sat perfectly still in the dim light of her living room, watching a show he didn't care about, unwilling to move a single muscle if it meant she'd wake up. The elevator to Anthony Crawford's penthouse smelled like fresh flowers and money. Ruby stood in it with her arms crossed, watching the floor numbers climb, and wondered for the 4th time in 10 minutes why she'd agreed to this. A Sunday lunch, at his place, with his friends, including, and this was the part that made her stomach flip, the bride and groom from the wedding she'd crashed 5 weeks ago. She'd named the puppy Biscuit. It seemed like the kind of name a golden retriever would give herself if she could talk. Warm, round, slightly ridiculous. Biscuit was at home right now, probably eating a shoe. The elevator opened directly into a wide foyer with marble floors and a view of the Manhattan skyline that belonged on a postcard. The air smelled like garlic and roasting meat and something with rosemary. Laughter drifted from somewhere deeper inside the apartment, the kind of loose, easy laughter that comes from people who've known each other long enough to skip the polite parts of conversation. Ruby smoothed the front of her blouse. She changed 3 times before leaving. The first outfit was too casual. The second was too much. The third was somewhere in between, and she'd stopped looking in the mirror before she could talk herself out of it. Anthony appeared from around the corner. Dark jeans, a grey sweater pushed up to his elbows, revealing forearms that she noticed and immediately wished she hadn't. His hair was slightly different than usual, less structured, like he'd been running his hands through it. It made him look younger, more approachable. "You came," he said. "You sound surprised. You almost cancelled 4 times. I counted the drafts. I only sent 2. I could feel the other 2. She bit back a smile. He stepped aside and gestured for her to come in, and as she passed him, she caught that scent again, the one from the doorway on the rainy afternoon. Warm, grounding. She filed it away in a part of her brain she pretended didn't exist. The living room was enormous, but somehow not cold. A long sectional sofa anchored the space, covered in throw pillows that looked like someone actually used them. Bookshelves lined one wall, real books, dog-eared and stacked sideways, not the decorative kind. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, and the late November light came in at an angle that turned everything golden. 4 people were already there. She recognized them immediately. The groom, now husband, was shorter than Anthony but built like someone who enjoyed weekends outdoors. He had warm brown skin, an easy grin, and the energy of a man who found everything at least a little bit funny. His wife stood beside him, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of beauty that didn't need effort and knew it. There she is. The groom spread his arms wide, grinning like she was a celebrity. The woman who almost stole my wedding. I'm Marcus. Ruby felt the heat climb her neck. I am so sorry, I cannot even begin to... Stop. Marcus held up a hand. If you apologize one more time, I'm going to be offended. That was the best thing that happened at our wedding. My Uncle Gerald fell asleep during the vows, and you made him jump so hard his toupee shifted. It was art. His wife, Elise, stepped forward and took Ruby's hand with both of hers. He's not exaggerating. Gerald still talks about it. Come sit. Do you drink wine? Yes. Please? And just like that, the terror dissolved. It didn't vanish all at once. It melted the way ice does in warm water, steadily, quietly, until Ruby realized she was sitting on the sofa with a glass of red wine, and she was laughing. Actually laughing. Marcus told the story of the wedding crash from his perspective, the look on the priest's face, the flower girl who started crying not because she was scared, but because she thought the wedding was being cancelled and she wouldn't get cake. And Ruby laughed until her ribs hurt. Anthony watched from across the room. He was leaning against the kitchen counter, arms folded, holding a glass he hadn't sipped from. Marcus said something about Ruby's dramatic entrance, and she covered her face with her hands, and Anthony noticed the way her fingers curled, half embarrassed, half delighted. He noticed the freckle just below her left ear. When had he started cataloguing things like that? Marcus appeared beside him, took a long sip of his drink, said nothing for 5 seconds, which, for Marcus, was a personal record. Don't, Anthony said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was going to say she's funny. She is. And smart. Also true. And you haven't stopped looking at her since she walked in. Anthony lifted his glass. I'm being a good host. You're being something. Marcus grinned. I've known you 15 years and I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her, like she's a puzzle you actually want to solve. Anthony said nothing. He took a sip of his wine. It tasted like oak and something darker, and it didn't wash away the truth sitting at the base of his throat. Because Marcus was right. Across the room, Elise had pulled Ruby into a conversation about her novels. Ruby was talking with her hands, a habit Anthony had noticed she only did when she was excited, describing a plot twist she was struggling with, and Elise was leaning in with the kind of genuine interest that can't be faked. She fits, Elise said later quietly when Ruby had gone to the bathroom. I like her. Marcus pointed at Elise with his wineglass. See? My wife likes her. That's basically a background check and a blessing in one. Anthony shook his head, but the corner of his mouth betrayed him. When Ruby came back, she sat a little closer to Anthony than before. Not intentionally, or maybe entirely intentionally. She couldn't tell anymore. The cushion between them on the sofa had disappeared at some point, and now his arm rested along the back of the couch behind her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it near her shoulders. Marcus watched them from the armchair, with the expression of a man observing a nature documentary in real time. You two, he said casually, swirling his drink, look like the kind of couple that pretends they're not a couple and fools absolutely no one. Ruby's wine nearly went up her nose. Anthony didn't flinch. Marcus, eat your food. I'm just saying what everyone in this room is thinking. No one asked you to narrate. Elise patted Marcus's knee. Let them breathe. I'm letting them breathe. I'm just noting for the record that the breathing seems very synchronized. Ruby looked at Anthony. He looked back at her. Something passed between them, fast, electric, unspoken, and then they both looked away at exactly the same time. Marcus leaned toward Elise and whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear, $10 says by Christmas. Make it 20, Elise whispered back. Ruby picked up her wine and drank deeply, grateful for the glass hiding her face. Her cheeks burned. Her pulse was doing something unreasonable. But underneath the embarrassment, underneath the deflection and the eye-rolling and the very deliberate effort to look unbothered, something warm had taken root. Something stubborn and quiet and completely terrifying. She liked him. Not as a friend, not as the man who'd rescued her from a police station. She liked him the way the heroines in her novels liked the men she wrote, fully, recklessly, with the kind of feeling that doesn't care whether you're ready for it. She just wasn't ready to say it. Not to him, not even to herself. The kitchen was quieter than the rest of the penthouse. From the living room, Ruby could still hear Marcus doing an impression of the priest's face during the wedding crash, complete with sound effects that Elise kept telling him to stop making, which only encouraged him. The laughter reached the kitchen in waves, warm, distant, like music from a neighbor's party. Ruby had offered to help bring out more glasses. Anthony said he'd show her where they were. It was an excuse, and they both knew it. A reason to step away from Marcus's commentary and the weight of being watched by people who saw too much. The kitchen was enormous. White marble counters, copper pots hanging from a rack above the stove, a window that let in the kind of late afternoon light that makes everything look softer than it really is. It smelled like the rosemary from lunch and something sweet, maybe a cake in the oven, maybe just the warmth of a room that had been cooking all day. Top shelf, Anthony pointed to a cabinet above the island. The crystal ones are in the back. Ruby reached up, stretching on her toes. Her fingers found the stem of a glass, thin and delicate, and she pulled it toward her. It slipped. The sound was sharp, a bright crash against the marble floor, glass scattering in every direction like pieces of a tiny, ruined chandelier. Oh no, I'm so sorry. She bent down immediately, instinct faster than reason, and her fingers found a shard before her brain could stop them. Ow. A thin line of red appeared on the pad of her index finger. Small, not deep, the kind of cut that stings more than it should. Don't move. Anthony was beside her in 2 steps. His voice had shifted, not louder but firmer. An instruction, not a suggestion. He looked at the glass on the floor, then at her hand, and something tightened behind his eyes. Before she could say it was nothing, because it was nothing, barely a scratch, she'd had worse from paper cuts, he lifted her, both hands on her waist, sure and steady, and she was sitting on the kitchen island before her brain caught up with her body. The marble was cool through her clothes. The height put her almost at his eye level, and the sudden closeness made the air between them feel thinner. It's really not, she started. Let me see. He took her hand. His fingers were warm and careful, turning her palm toward the light to examine the cut. She watched him open a small first aid kit from the drawer beside the stove, one of those organized, well-stocked kits that only people who plan for everything actually own. He pulled out antiseptic and a bandage and moved back toward her. He stepped between her knees to get closer, casually, like it was the most practical angle and nothing more. It was not nothing more. Ruby's breath hitched. She felt the fabric of his sweater brush against the inside of her knee, and every nerve in her body rearranged itself around that single point of contact. The kitchen was too warm. The light was too soft. He was too close, and she couldn't think about anything except the line of his jaw and the way his brow furrowed slightly when he focused. He dabbed the antiseptic with a cotton pad. It stung, and she hissed through her teeth. Sorry, he murmured. Big tough CEO and you can't even apply a band-aid without hurting someone? He glanced up. His eyes were that gray-green she'd been trying not to think about for weeks, and at this distance, she could see flecks of gold near the center. Big tough writer and you can't handle a little sting. I handle rejection letters from publishers. A cut finger is nothing. The corner of his mouth twitched. He wrapped the bandage around her finger with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his hands, broad, strong, built for boardrooms and firm handshakes. But here, in this kitchen, they moved like they were handling something precious. He finished, smoothed the edge of the bandage with his thumb, and then, without looking up, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to her wrapped finger. Soft, slow, deliberate. There, he said, his voice quieter now. That should fix it. Ruby forgot how to speak. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. The place where his lips had touched still tingled, And she was looking at his mouth. She couldn't stop looking at his mouth, and the thought that flashed through her mind was so loud it almost escaped as words. "Kiss me. Please just kiss me." Instead, she leaned forward, slowly, placed her lips against his cheek. Let them rest there for a second longer than a thank you required. The stubble along his jaw was rough against her mouth. He smelled like wine and cedar and warmth, and she felt his breath catch, a small, sharp intake that he tried to cover but didn't. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't move, didn't step back. His hand was still holding hers, and the space between their faces was the width of a breath. And everything in that kitchen, the light, the silence, the smell of rosemary and cake, pressed in around them like the world was holding still. "Well, well, well." The voice came from the kitchen doorway like a bucket of cold water. Marcus stood there, arms folded, shoulder against the frame, grinning so wide it looked physically painful. Elise was beside him, one hand over her mouth, eyes sparkling with the specific delight of someone watching exactly what she'd predicted. "Don't mind us," Marcus said. "We're just here for glasses, not interrupting anything." Clearly nothing was happening. "Nothing was happening," Anthony said, stepping back from Ruby with the controlled composure of a man defusing a situation. His voice was even, calm, not a single crack in the surface. "Sure." Marcus nodded slowly. "And I'm the Queen of England." "The tension in here," Elise said, half laughing. "You could cut it with a knife. You two should really just kiss and get it over with." Ruby felt the heat rise from her chest to her forehead like a wave. She was certain her face was the color of the wine they'd been drinking. She looked at Anthony, searching for something, a sign, a glance, anything that confirmed what she'd felt 30 seconds ago was real and mutual, and not just her imagination doing what it always did. Anthony looked at her. Steady, unreadable. "Don't listen to them," he said. Quiet, almost gentle. And that was it. 5 words, no smile, no wink, no subtext she could grab onto. "Don't listen to them." Ruby slid off the counter, picked up a glass that hadn't broken, walked past Marcus and Elise with a smile she assembled from spare parts, and carried back to the living room like a mask. She sat on the sofa and drank her wine and laughed at Marcus's next joke and told herself, firmly, clearly, with the kind of conviction she used to rewrite bad chapters, that Anthony Crawford was not interested, that the kiss on her finger had been a joke, that the way he'd looked at her was politeness, proximity, nothing. She told herself this because the alternative, that he wanted her and she wanted him and neither of them was brave enough to say it, was too frightening to hold. In the kitchen, Anthony stood alone. The broken glass still glittered on the floor. He gripped the edge of the counter with both hands and let his head drop forward. He could still feel her lips on his cheek, still smell the faint sweetness of her hair, still hear the way she'd whispered thank you like it was a secret, meant only for him. He wanted her, completely, in a way that made his chest ache and his carefully constructed composure feel like a house of cards. But she'd been through enough. Her father, the wedding, the loneliness she tried so hard to hide. The last thing she needed was him charging in with feelings that might overwhelm her, might scare her away, might ruin the only thing that was making her smile again. So he cleaned up the glass, washed his hands, straightened his sweater, and walked back into the living room like nothing had happened. But something had, and they both knew it. Biscuit knew before Ruby did. 3 days after the Sunday lunch, the puppy started doing something strange. Every time Ruby's phone buzzed with Anthony's name, Biscuit's ears perked up. She'd waddle over, plant herself on Ruby's feet, and stare up with the kind of knowing expression no 8-pound animal should be capable of. "Stop looking at me like that," Ruby told her. Biscuit tilted her head. "He's just a friend." Biscuit sneezed, the kind of sneeze that sounded like an opinion. Ruby went back to her phone and reread his last message for the 3rd time. Just got out of a 3-hour meeting where a man in a bow tie tried to explain blockchain using a pizza metaphor. "Tell me something interesting before my brain files for resignation." She typed back, "I burned toast so badly this morning the smoke alarm went off and Biscuit hid behind the toilet for 20 minutes. That's not interesting. That's arson. It's breakfast. It's a cry for help. Can you cook anything? I make excellent reservations." She could almost hear him laughing through the screen, that short, surprised sound from the police station. It lived in her memory now, tucked between things she replayed when she couldn't sleep. The days had a shape she hadn't planned. Morning texts, afternoon voice notes, his voice low and dry, always between meetings, always making her press the phone harder against her ear. Evening calls that started as 5 minutes and stretched into an hour without either of them noticing. She told herself it was friendship, but the Sunday lunch had broken something open. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back on that marble counter, his hands on hers, his lips on her finger, that one unbearable moment where the air between them turned solid. Then the 5 words that deflated everything. Don't listen to them. She turned them over 100 times. Was he telling her to ignore Marcus because the teasing was embarrassing, or because the suggestion wasn't something he wanted? She didn't know. And Ruby Caldwell hated not knowing. She wrote stories for a living. She decided what people felt, but this messy, inconvenient thing in her chest refused to follow any plot she recognized. On Thursday, she woke with a headache that became a sore throat that became a fever by noon. By evening, she was on the couch wrapped in 2 blankets, shivering under both. Biscuit pressed against her side, occasionally licking her wrist as though checking she was still alive. Her phone screen was too bright, so she'd turned it face down an hour ago. It buzzed anyway. Anthony. You haven't texted in 6 hours. Either you're writing something brilliant, or something's wrong. She typed with one hand. Flu. Fever. Dying. Tell Biscuit I love her. His reply came in 9 seconds. What's your temperature? Don't know. Thermometer is in the bathroom and the bathroom is far. How far? 12 steps. Might as well be Everest. 2 minutes of nothing. Then, I'm coming. You don't need to. I didn't ask. 40 minutes later, a knock. She dragged herself to the door, blanket around her shoulders like a cape made of defeat. Anthony stood there holding a pharmacy bag, wearing the expression of a man who had already made every decision about the next 12 hours. He looked at her, hair plastered to her forehead, nose red, eyes glassy. You look terrible, he said. Thank you. I worked hard on it. He stepped inside, pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. His palm was cool and steady, and she leaned into it before she could stop herself. You're burning up. He opened the bag. Thermometer, ibuprofen, electrolytes, soup from a deli she recognized as expensive. Where's your overnight bag? My what? A bag, with clothes, for staying somewhere that isn't here. Anthony, you're running a fever alone with no food and a puppy who can't call an ambulance. Pack a bag. You and Biscuit are coming with me. I don't need to be rescued. This isn't a rescue, it's logistics. It feels like a rescue. Then consider it a hostile takeover. I'm acquiring you and the dog. Non-negotiable. Every stubborn bone in her body wanted to refuse, but the fever had eaten her willpower, and his voice, calm, certain, immovable, made something inside her stop fighting. She packed a bag. He picked up Biscuit, who licked his chin with the enthusiasm of a puppy who'd been waiting for this exact moment. He carried the bag in one hand and the dog in the other, and Ruby followed on legs that felt made of wet paper. In the car, Biscuit sat on her lap. Ruby leaned her head against the cold window. The city slid past in streaks of light. She could see Anthony's reflection in the glass, jaw set, eyes on the road, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the console close enough to touch. She didn't touch it, but she wanted to. More than the fever, more than the headache. She wanted to reach across that small distance and hold his hand. She closed her eyes instead. And somewhere between her apartment and his penthouse, wrapped in a blanket with a puppy in her arms, and a man beside her who had dropped everything because she was sick, Ruby Caldwell quietly stopped pretending this was friendship. Gloria Mendez had opinions about everything, and she shared them with the confidence of a woman who had never once been wrong in her own mind. She was Anthony's cook, had been for 11 years, and she ran his kitchen with absolute authority and a wooden spoon she pointed at people when they disagreed. Short, round, warm in the way bread is warm out of the oven, she had been waiting for Anthony to bring a woman home for so long that when Ruby appeared wrapped in a blanket carrying a golden retriever, Gloria nearly crossed herself. Finally, she whispered to no one, clutching the dish towel to her chest. The first morning, Ruby woke to the smell of chicken broth, real broth made with bones and celery and patience. She followed the scent to the kitchen, where Gloria was stirring a pot and narrating a telenovela scene. And then Valentina, who everyone thought was dead, walks into the party wearing red. Red, with her ex-husband's brother on her arm. Gloria turned and saw Ruby. Her face broke into a smile. "You. Sit. Eat." "I'm really not that—" "I didn't ask." "Sit." She placed a bowl of broth in front of Ruby with the authority of a prescription. "Mr. Crawford said you have fever. This fixes fever. My grandmother's recipe. She lived to 97. Ruby ate. The broth was extraordinary, salty and deep, with a warmth that settled into her bones. Biscuit sat at her feet, staring up with profound hope. "She likes you," Gloria said, nodding at the puppy. "Dogs know people. When Mr. Crawford first brought her here, she bit his shoe. Italian shoe. Expensive, he didn't even get mad." She paused, spoon in the air. "That's when I knew." "Knew what?" Gloria smiled, like Ruby had asked the most obvious question in the world, and went back to stirring. Anthony stayed home that first day, told his assistant to clear his schedule. When Ruby protested that he didn't need to miss work for a cold, he said it wasn't a cold. It was 102 degrees, and she could argue when her temperature dropped below 100. She argued anyway. He ignored her. They fell into a routine that had no right to feel this natural. Mornings, Gloria made breakfast while Ruby sat at the kitchen island in his borrowed clothes, his sweatshirt, sleeves too long, smelling exactly like him. Anthony appeared with coffee, hair still damp from the shower, reading news on his tablet while Biscuit chased her own tail across the floor. Afternoons, Ruby napped on the couch. She'd wake to find a glass of water on the table that hadn't been there before, and Biscuit curled against her chest. Evenings, the three of them on the sofa. Ruby chose the shows. Anthony complained about every one. Gloria brought dessert and commentary. "This is just like Rosa's betrayal," Gloria announced on the second night, watching a drama where two people who clearly loved each other kept misunderstanding everything. Season 4. When Eduardo refuses to tell Magdalena how he feels because he thinks she deserves better. She looked directly at Anthony. "Sound familiar?" "Gloria," Anthony said without looking up. "Go home." "I'm just saying. Some men wait so long to speak that the woman decides for herself. And then he's eating dinner alone, wondering where it went wrong." She patted Ruby's shoulder. "Good night, dear. Soup for tomorrow is in the fridge." The door closed, and the silence that followed had a texture, thick, warm, full of everything Gloria had said without saying. Ruby pulled the blanket tighter. "She's something. She's a menace with a ladle. She cares about you. She cares about everyone. It's her only flaw." Ruby smiled. Her fever had dropped to 99 that afternoon. She was curled in the corner of the sofa, feet tucked beneath her, and Anthony sat at the other end with Biscuit sprawled across his lap like she'd always lived there. He was scrolling through his phone, but she could tell he wasn't reading. His thumb moved too slowly. His eyes weren't tracking. "Anthony." He looked up. "Why did you stay home today?" "Because you're sick." "People get sick. They don't need a CEO babysitter." He put the phone down, looked at her the way he sometimes did, steady, unhurried, like he was deciding how much truth to hand over. "Because you would have spent the day alone pretending you were fine, and I've watched you do that long enough to know what it costs you." The words landed in the center of her chest, quiet, precise, impossible to deflect. She opened her mouth to joke, something light, something to break the tension. Nothing came. He held her gaze a moment longer, then picked up the remote. "Your turn to pick something terrible." She chose a cooking competition. He said the judges were wrong. She said he wouldn't last 10 minutes in that kitchen. He said he'd buy the kitchen. She called him insufferable. He said that was the nicest thing she'd ever said to him. Day 3, day 4, each morning easier, each evening harder to imagine ending. Ruby's fever broke on the 4th morning. She stood in the guest room, bag packed, staring at the neatly made bed with a feeling she couldn't name. She didn't want to leave, Not the penthouse, not Gloria's kitchen, not the sofa where they argued about everything. She didn't want to leave him, and that terrified her more than the fever ever had. Her bag was sitting by the guest room door like a verdict. Ruby stood beside it in her own clothes for the first time in 4 days, and the difference felt wrong. His sweatshirt, the grey one with the frayed cuff she'd been pulling at, was folded on the bed. She'd washed it. It no longer smelled like him. She almost regretted that. Biscuit sat at her feet, tail still, watching with patient concern. "We're going home," Ruby said. Biscuit didn't move. "It's our apartment. We like our apartment." Biscuit lay down and rested her chin on her paws. Traitor. From somewhere down the hallway, Gloria clattered dishes in the kitchen. The penthouse was filled with late morning light, the kind that makes everything look like a memory even while it's happening. Ruby could smell coffee, fresh bread, the faint trace of lemon cleaner. 4 days. That's all it had been. 4 days of shared meals and shrinking distances on the sofa. 4 days of falling asleep to the sound of him in the next room, a door closing, a faucet running. 4 days of waking up and knowing he was there before she opened her eyes. She needed to leave before she forgot how to live without this. Ruby picked up her bag and walked toward Anthony's bedroom to say goodbye. The door was open. He was standing near the window with his back to her, shirtless. The light traced the line of his shoulders, broad, defined, warm-toned skin smooth across his back. A pair of grey sweatpants hung low on his hips, and his hair was damp, pushed back like he'd just stepped out of the shower. Ruby stopped in the doorway. She meant to speak, meant to clear her throat, say something casual, but her voice had packed its own bag and left. She stared, longer than she should have. He turned. Their eyes met. She waited for him to grab a shirt, to make a joke, to do the thing they always did, deflect, dodge, pretend. He didn't. Something in his expression shifted. The composure he wore like armor cracked, not dramatically. Just enough. A softening around his eyes, a stillness in the way he held himself. Like he'd been carrying something heavy and had finally set it down. He walked toward her, slowly, deliberately. Ruby's pulse thudded in her ears. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, close enough to count the shades in his eyes. He lifted one hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingertips grazed her temple. Then he kissed her. Not softly, not carefully. This kiss had weeks behind it. His mouth found hers with a certainty that made her knees dissolve, firm and warm, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, fingers threading into her hair. She dropped the bag. Her hands found his chest, bare, solid, burning under her palms, and she kissed him back with everything she'd been holding since the kitchen counter, since the police station, since the moment she'd looked up at a stranger in a dark suit and felt the ground tilt. He walked her backward until her shoulders met the wall, pressed into her, one hand braced beside her head, the other on her waist. She could taste coffee and something that was just him. Her fingers traced his stomach, and he made a sound low in his throat that she felt more than heard. He pulled back, barely, and kissed the corner of her mouth, her jaw, the spot below her ear that made her gasp. She grabbed his shoulders and pulled him back. He lifted her, hands under her thighs, her legs wrapping around him, and he carried her to the armchair by the window, sat down. She settled on his lap, facing him, knees on either side of his hips. Her hands cradled his face. His rested on her waist, thumbs tracing slow circles against her shirt. They kissed like the room was on fire and neither of them cared. Her phone rang. She ignored it. His mouth was on her collarbone, and thinking wasn't possible. It rang again, and again. She pulled away, breathless, forehead against his. Her lips were swollen. Her heart was doing something dangerous. "I have to—" "I know." She climbed off his lap on legs that barely worked and found the phone in her bag. Unknown number. "Hello?" A voice, professional, measured, trained to deliver difficult news without emotion. "Miss Caldwell, this is Mount Sinai Hospital. Your father, Robert Caldwell, has been admitted to the emergency department." The room tilted. She looked at Anthony. Whatever he saw on her face made him stand immediately. "What happened?" she whispered. Severe chest pain. He's stable but under observation. We'd recommend you come as soon as possible. She hung up. The phone felt like a brick. My dad. Her voice cracked on the second word. He's in the hospital. Anthony was already moving. Shirt from the closet, keys from the nightstand. He took her hand with one of his, and Biscuit's leash with the other. Let's go, he said. No questions, no hesitation. They were in the car in 3 minutes. Ruby stared through the windshield at the city rushing past, her lips still tingling from a kiss that had changed everything, her chest hollow with a fear nothing could fix. Anthony's hand found hers on the center console. This time she held it. The hospital smelled like bleach and waiting. Ruby had always hated hospitals, the fluorescent certainty of them, the way time moved differently inside, slower and heavier. The last time she'd been in one was the night her mother died. She'd been 22, gripping her father's hand while a doctor explained things she didn't want to understand. Now, her father was on the other side of the door, and she was gripping Anthony's hand instead. They'd arrived in 15 minutes. Anthony parked in a spot she was fairly sure wasn't legal, left Biscuit with the bewildered concierge at the entrance, and walked Ruby through the emergency doors without letting go. A nurse led them to a curtained bay. Robert Caldwell was propped on thin pillows, face pale, a monitor beeping beside him. He looked smaller than Ruby remembered. Thinner. The confident, stubborn man who had refused to listen 4 months ago now lay under a hospital blanket, looking like someone the world had chewed up and set aside. His eyes found hers. Ruby. She walked to the bed, took his hand. It was warm and dry and felt like her childhood. Sunday mornings and pancake batter and the sound of him singing off-key while her mother laughed. What happened? Her voice was steadier than she expected. Robert closed his eyes for a moment. Stress. That's what the doctor thinks. My chest, I thought it was something worse. He paused. Vanessa filed for divorce. Ruby said nothing. 4 months. That's all it lasted. She said the marriage wasn't what she expected. A bitter sound escaped his throat. What she expected was my money. The arrangement, the one she insisted on, the one I signed because I trusted her, gives her half. Half. Half of the retirement her father had spent 35 years building. Half of the house her mother had decorated room by room, handed to a woman who had only pretended to share his life. Ruby wanted to scream. She wanted to say, I told you. She wanted to ask why. Why hadn't he listened? Why had he chosen a stranger over his own daughter? Why had he shut out the one person who saw the truth? She didn't say any of that. She squeezed his hand. You're going to be okay, she said. Behind her, Anthony stood near the curtain, silent, present, not inserting himself into a conversation that wasn't his, but close enough that Ruby could feel him there like a wall at her back, solid and not going anywhere. The doctor came. The chest pain was stress-related, not cardiac. He recommended rest, follow-ups, and what he carefully called reduced emotional strain. Robert nodded with the obedient expression of a man who had learned that ignoring advice had consequences. They admitted him overnight. Ruby pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. Anthony appeared at her side. I'm getting you something to eat. I'm not hungry. That wasn't a question. He disappeared before she could argue. 20 minutes later, soup, water, a sandwich she didn't ask for, and a blanket he'd somehow convinced a nurse to give him. He draped it over her shoulders, set the food on the tray, and sat beside her. You should go home, she said. You have work. I cancelled tomorrow. You can't keep cancelling your life for me. He looked at her. That look, the one that bypassed every defense she owned. Yes, I can. 3 words. No argument attached. Just fact. She ate the soup because she knew he wouldn't leave until she did. It was warm and tasted like nothing and everything at once, and halfway through the bowl she realized her hands had stopped shaking. Her father slept. The monitor beeped. The hospital moved in its own rhythm. Footsteps, murmured voices, the distant rattle of a cart. At some point Ruby's head found Anthony's shoulder. He shifted so she could rest more comfortably, and his arm came around her, heavy and warm. She could feel his heartbeat through his shirt. Steady even, the most reliable thing in the room. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here." His lips brushed the top of her head. Not quite a kiss, something quieter. "There's nowhere else I'd be." She closed her eyes. The exhaustion of the day, the packed bag, the hallway, the kiss that still hummed beneath her skin, the phone call that shattered everything, settled over her like a heavy coat. But underneath the worry and the fear and the anger at a father who had broken his own life, chasing love in the wrong place, there was something else. Anthony's hand on her back, his heartbeat against her ear, the way he showed up, not with speeches or promises, but with soup and blankets and the simple act of staying. She'd spent her career writing love stories, giving characters the kind of love that felt too perfect, too tidy, too certain. This wasn't that. This was messy and inconvenient, and it had started in a police station and nearly ended in a hospital room. But it was real, and real, she was starting to understand, was better than anything she'd ever written. She fell asleep against his shoulder. He didn't move until morning. Robert Caldwell had never been a man who cried easily. He'd cried at his wife's funeral, quietly, one hand on Ruby's shoulder. He'd cried at her college graduation, 3 quick tears he wiped before she could see those she had seen. But outside those moments, Robert kept his emotions folded and stored like winter clothes in summer. So when Ruby walked into his hospital room the next morning and found her father sitting up in bed with wet cheeks and trembling hands, something inside her broke open in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Dad." He looked at her. His eyes were red, swollen, stripped of every wall he'd ever built. The hospital gown hung loose on his frame. The breakfast tray beside him was untouched. Dry toast, a small container of orange juice, a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She took everything she could. His voice was raw, scraped clean. "The lawyer called this morning. Vanessa's already filed the paperwork. She wants the house, half the savings, the car she picked out 2 months ago." He shook his head slowly. "I bought that car because she said she loved the color." Ruby sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't trust herself to speak yet. 4 months, Ruby. 4 months, and she already had an exit plan. The lawyer says she probably had one before the wedding. He looked down at his hands, large, rough, the hands of a man who'd spent decades building something real. "I was so sure. I was so sure she loved me." The silence after that sentence was enormous. Ruby reached over and took both his hands in hers. They were cold. She held them anyway, the way her mother used to when Ruby came home from school upset and couldn't explain why. Just held them. "You wanted to be happy," she said. "That's not a crime. I wanted it so badly I stopped seeing straight." He looked up. "And I pushed away the one person who was trying to protect me." There it was, the thing Ruby had been waiting months to hear. Not because she wanted to be right, but because the silence between them had been louder than any argument. "I called you prejudiced, said you couldn't accept me being happy." His chin trembled. "You were the only one who saw her clearly, and I treated you like the enemy." "Dad, let me finish." He squeezed her hands. "I am so sorry. For the wedding. For not inviting you. For choosing a woman I barely knew over the daughter who's been beside me her whole life." His voice cracked on the last word. "Your mother would be ashamed of me." Ruby shook her head. The tears were already falling, warm and fast, sliding down her jaw and landing on their joined hands. Mum would understand. She'd be furious, but she'd understand. She always did. Robert let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She'd have seen through Vanessa in 5 minutes. 3. Mum was fast. He laughed, a real broken, beautiful laugh, and pulled Ruby toward him. She leaned into the embrace, her face pressed against his shoulder, and for the first time in months she felt like his daughter again. Not the difficult one, not the one who couldn't let go, just his daughter. They held each other for a long time. The monitor beeped. The hospital sounds drifted in through the curtain. And somewhere in that embrace, the distance that had grown between them, built brick by brick out of pride and stubbornness and the kind of loneliness that makes people reach for the wrong hand, began to come apart. When Ruby finally pulled back, she wiped her face with both palms and took a breath that shook on the way in. "We need to get you a good lawyer," she said. "I have one. Anthony recommended someone." Ruby blinked. "Anthony?" He came by this morning, before you woke up. Robert glanced toward the hallway. Told me he knew a lawyer who handles exactly this. Made a call right there. Had the appointment set before he left. Ruby turned toward the door as if she might see him still standing there. The hallway was empty. He also brought me real coffee. Robert gestured at a paper cup on the windowsill. Not the hospital cup, a proper one, with a logo from a cafe Ruby recognized. And a book. Said the hospital television would rot my brain. Ruby picked up the book, a paperback thriller dog-eared like it had been read before. She opened the cover and found a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. Clean, sharp, slightly impatient. Robert, hospitals are boring. This should help in AC. She stared at the note, then pressed the book against her chest and closed her eyes. This man, this impossible, stubborn, quiet, steady man who showed up with lawyers and coffee and used paperbacks, who sat at bedsides and cancelled meetings and carried puppies and never once asked for a single thing in return. He's a good man, Robert said quietly. Ruby opened her eyes. Her father was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen in years, tender, knowing, the way he used to look at her mother across the dinner table. I know, she whispered. Don't let that one go. She placed the book back on the windowsill, straightened the blanket over her father's legs, kissed his forehead the way he used to kiss hers when she was small. I won't, she said, and she meant it with every single part of herself. The lawyer's name was Diana Park, and she did not believe in small talk. She arrived at Robert Caldwell's apartment 2 days after his discharge, carrying a leather briefcase, a stack of documents, and the energy of a woman who had dismantled bad marriages the way surgeons remove tumors, with precision, detachment, and zero sympathy for the disease. Ruby opened the door. Diana shook her hand once firmly and said, Where's your father? Living room. Good. This won't take long. It took 3 hours. Ruby sat beside her father on the couch while Diana laid out the situation with the calm brutality of someone reading a weather forecast. The marriage contract Robert had signed, the one Vanessa's own attorney had drafted, the one Robert had agreed to because love had made him careless, entitled her to half of his liquid assets and a claim on the house. Can we fight it? Ruby asked. Diana looked at her over the rim of her glasses. We can negotiate. Fighting would cost more than settling, and the contract is legally sound. She turned to Robert. Whoever advised you to sign this did not have your interests in mind. No one advised me, Robert said quietly. I signed it myself. The silence that followed had the weight of a confession. Diana outlined the options. A lump sum settlement that would end things quickly, mediation, which would take longer, or litigation, which would drain whatever Vanessa didn't take. She recommended the settlement. It was painful but clean. Robert agreed. When Diana left, Ruby walked her to the door. Your father made a mistake, Diana said, pulling on her coat. An expensive one, but not an uncommon one. Loneliness makes people sign things they shouldn't. Ruby nodded. Diana was already in the elevator, briefcase in hand, moving on to the next broken thing that needed fixing. Ruby closed the door and leaned against it. The apartment was quiet. Her father's apartment, the one he'd shared with her mother for 28 years, the one with her mother's curtains still hanging in the bedroom and her mother's cookbook still on the kitchen shelf, felt different now. Emptier, like something had been subtracted from its bones. She found her father in the kitchen, standing at the counter, staring at nothing. A glass of water sat untouched beside his hand. Dad. He didn't turn. The settlement will take about a month. She kept her voice gentle, practical, the way he needed her to be right now. Diana said the house is safe. She can only claim the savings and the joint accounts. That's nearly everything your mother and I saved. Ruby's chest tightened. Her mother's face flashed through her mind, warm, laughing, rolling pasta dough in this exact kitchen on a Sunday, while Ruby sat on the counter swinging her legs. That money wasn't numbers. It was years, sacrifices, things they chose not to buy so the future would be comfortable. And now half of it belonged to a woman who had never loved him. Ruby wanted to break something. Instead, she walked to the counter and stood beside her father, close enough that their shoulders touched. We'll figure it out, she said. Robert turned to look at her. His eyes were clearer than they'd been in the hospital, less fragile, more present, but the sadness in them was deep, the kind that doesn't go away with sleep or time, but only with forgiveness. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I need you to let me finish." She nodded. "When your mother died, I thought that was it. I thought love was done with me." He set the glass down. His hands were steady, but his voice wasn't. "And then Vanessa appeared, and she was bright and young, and she made me feel like the world still had something left to offer. I didn't see what she was. I didn't want to." He paused. "But you did. You saw it immediately, and when you tried to warn me, I chose her over you. My own daughter." Ruby's throat closed. "I told myself you were jealous, that you couldn't accept me moving on from your mother. I told myself a lot of things that let me keep believing in her and stop believing in you." His voice broke. "That was the worst thing I've ever done, worse than the money, worse than the marriage. Losing your trust, that's the thing I can't settle with a lawyer." Ruby pressed her lips together. The tears came anyway. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said. "I know that's not how this works. I'm asking you to let me earn it back, however long that takes." She looked at her father, this proud, stubborn, loving man who had taught her to ride a bike and walked her to school every day until she was old enough to be embarrassed by it. A man standing in front of her, shaking, asking not to be forgiven but to be given the chance to deserve it. She took his hand. "You don't have to earn it," she said. "You're my dad. You already have it." He pulled her into his arms. She pressed her face into his chest and breathed in the smell of him, laundry detergent and aftershave and something older, something that had lived in her memory since before she had words for it. They stood there in the kitchen. No words, no sound, except the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of the city outside. Some things don't need language. Some things just need two people standing still, choosing each other again. Ruby didn't remember the drive back. Fragments, city lights blurring, Biscuit asleep in the back seat, Anthony's hand on hers, the elevator, her keys, the door opening to an apartment that smelled like closed windows. Anthony set Biscuit down. The dog padded to her spot on the rug, turned 3 circles and collapsed. Ruby stood in the middle of her living room, shoes still on, coat still buttoned, and felt the weight of the last 2 days settle on her like something physical. "Take a shower," Anthony said. "I'll be here." She walked to the bathroom, turned the water as hot as it would go, and stood under it until the knot in her chest loosened. She pressed her forehead against the tile and thought about everything, about a kiss that still burned under her skin. She dried off, pulled on a soft shirt and cotton pants, and walked barefoot to the living room. Anthony was on the sofa, jacket off, sleeves rolled, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked like a man who had reached a conclusion he couldn't take back. She crossed the room, didn't sit beside him, didn't take the armchair or any of the safe distances she'd been choosing for weeks. She sat on his lap, sideways, legs over his thigh, her head fitting into the space between his shoulder and his neck. His arms came around her immediately, one across her back, one on her knee, and the warmth of him was so complete her eyes stung. "Thank you," she whispered against his neck. "For the hospital, for my dad, for never once making me ask." His hand moved to her face, thumb tracing her jaw, slow, deliberate. She lifted her eyes. The expression on his face stopped her breathing. No shield, no sarcasm, no careful composure. Just him, open, raw, looking at her with something so fierce and so tender it didn't have a name. Ruby. Her name, said low and rough, like it cost him something. "I need to tell you something. All of it. Because if I stop halfway, I'll talk myself out of it, and I'm tired of doing that." She didn't move. "I think about you all the time. In the middle of meetings that cost more than most people's houses, I'm reading your texts under the table and smiling like an idiot." His hand on her jaw trembled. "I want to be with you, not sometimes, all the time. I want to wake up next to you and argue about breakfast, and walk that ridiculous dog, and listen to you read chapters out loud when you think I'm not paying attention." Ruby's vision blurred. "I want you in a way that terrifies me, because I've never wanted anything this much, and I don't have a backup plan if you say no." He swallowed. "So I'm asking. Please, be with me." The tears fell. Both cheeks, fast and warm. She cupped his face, felt the stubble under her palms, the tension in his jaw. "Yes," she said, 100 times yes. She laughed through the tears. "I've been in love with you since you showed up at my door with a puppy and no good excuse." He pulled her closer, foreheads touching, noses brushing. And then he kissed her. Not like the bedroom. That had been hunger and restraint. This was different. A man who had said everything he needed to say and was now saying the rest with his mouth. Slow at first, lips soft, tasting the salt of her tears, then deeper. His hand in her hair, tilting her head, his tongue finding hers in a way that made her fingers curl against his chest. From the rug, Biscuit barked, sharp, indignant. They broke apart, laughing. Ruby buried her face in his neck. Anthony dropped his head back against the sofa, grinning at the ceiling. "She's jealous," Ruby said. "She has terrible timing." They scooped Biscuit into their arms. The puppy squirmed, licking every face in reach, tail vibrating. Ruby kissed Biscuit's head. Anthony kissed Ruby's temple. For 1 perfect minute, the three of them sat on the floor tangled together. Then Ruby stood, held out her hand, looked at him with an expression that left nothing to interpretation. He took it. She led him down the hallway, and he followed with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally stopped holding back. What happened next was not the collision she'd imagined. It was slower. His hands traced her body like he was reading something only he could understand. Every shiver answered with his mouth against her skin. He undressed her with patience that made her ache, and when she stood before him with nothing left to hide, his eyes moved over her with a reverence that made her feel more beautiful than words ever could. He whispered her name against her collarbone, against her ribs, against the inside of her wrist. She pulled him closer and found him trembling too. They fell into each other the way the tide meets the shore, inevitable, complete, with the tenderness of two people who had waited long enough to mean it. And after, tangled in sheets that smelled like both of them, her head on his chest, she said, "You have the stamina of 10 athletes." That grin, slow, devastating, impossibly smug. "You haven't seen anything yet." Is that a promise? Consider it a corporate guarantee. She kissed his chest, closed her eyes, felt his heartbeat under her lips, steady, strong hers. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruby Caldwell fell asleep knowing exactly where she belonged. 6 weeks later, on a cold Sunday morning that smelled like coffee and snow, Anthony Crawford got down on one knee in his living room with a small velvet box in his hand. Tied around the box was a pink ribbon, the same pink ribbon that had once been around Biscuit's neck. Ruby was standing by the kitchen island in his sweatshirt, the grey one she'd stolen permanently, with a mug halfway to her mouth and her hair still wild from sleep. She looked at the box, then at the ribbon, then at him. The mug didn't make it to her lips. "Anthony, I had a speech planned, something impressive that would make you cry in a dignified way." He opened the box. A ring, simple, elegant, catching the winter light. "But I'm looking at you right now with toothpaste on your chin, and the speech doesn't matter. I want this every morning. You, Biscuit, chewing my shoes, your manuscript pages all over my desk." She was already crying. "Marry me, Ruby. Not because it makes sense, because nothing has made sense since you walked into a stranger's wedding and wrecked the place, and I don't want the version of my life that existed before that." She set the mug down, walked to him, knelt on the floor so they were eye to eye. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I'd have said yes in the police station if you'd asked." He slid the ring on. It fit perfectly. Biscuit, no longer a puppy, now a lanky adolescent, barked so loud it echoed off the windows. She bounded over, pushed between them and licked both their faces. "She knows," Ruby said, laughing, wiping tears with one hand and dog drool with the other. Anthony pulled them both close. She always knew. The wedding was small, 30 people, a rooftop garden in the West Village on a Saturday in April when the city smelled like rain and new leaves. Ruby wore ivory, hair loose, the way Anthony liked it. She carried wildflowers, messy and imperfect, because arranged bouquets reminded her of someone else's wedding, and she'd caused enough problems at those. Her father walked her down the aisle. Robert Caldwell moved slowly. The last few months had taken weight from his frame, but his arm was steady under hers, and his hand gripped her fingers with the quiet ferocity of a man who understood how close he'd come to losing the only thing that mattered. "Your mother would have loved this," he whispered as they reached the end. Ruby squeezed his hand. "She's here." He kissed her cheek, placed her hand in Anthony's, sat down beside Aunt Helen, who was already crying into a handkerchief she'd brought specifically for this purpose. Anthony looked at Ruby. She looked at him. And the rest of the ceremony was just words surrounding what already existed. Marcus gave the toast. He stood with champagne and the grin of a man who had been rehearsing this since the day he met Ruby in his own living room. "Anthony Crawford is the best man I've ever known. Loyal, generous, brilliant." He paused. "He's also the only man I know whose love story started with a woman crashing my wedding." Laughter swept through the rooftop. Ruby walked into a church that wasn't hers, stopped a ceremony that wasn't her father's, ended up in a police station, and walked out with the best thing that ever happened to my best friend. He raised his glass. "To the wrong wedding that got everything right." Elise raised hers beside him. Gloria at the next table dabbed her face and whispered that this was better than any season finale she'd ever seen. Ruby rolled her eyes. Anthony pulled her by the waist and kissed her forehead. And that was enough. Months later, a Sunday morning in the penthouse, Ruby sat on the sofa with her notebook open, trying to write. The words were slow today, tangled in the same happy fog that had settled over everything and refused to leave. Biscuit, fully grown now, enormous, golden, and profoundly lazy, slept with her head on Ruby's foot. One ear twitched when the refrigerator hummed. Otherwise nothing. Anthony came from the kitchen carrying a glass of juice, set it beside her, leaned over her shoulder and read the screen. "Is the hero based on me?" Ruby didn't look up. "The hero doesn't have nearly as big an ego. So no." She bit her lip to keep from smiling. She'd said it to provoke him, because every hero she'd write from now on would carry pieces of him. He was wonderful, and had every right to think so. She'd just never say that out loud, because giving Anthony Crawford more ego ammunition was a public safety concern. He laughed, kissed the top of her head, then placed his hand on her belly, round now, unmistakable, and felt the kick that came like a tiny answer from someone who hadn't arrived yet, but already belonged. Biscuit raised her head, looked at them both with the ancient patience of a dog who had been there from the very beginning. Then she went back to sleep. The apartment was quiet. The city hummed outside. The screen blinked. And the life they'd built, imperfect, noisy, full of burned toast and dog hair, and arguments about television and love so big it barely fit inside four walls, was exactly what it was supposed to be. Not a fairy tale. Something better. Something real. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.